Hi there. Today again we want to talk about targets and how to integrate them into your charts in Power BI to add context for your users, but today we wanted to be a bit more dynamic. So here you kind of see where we ended off. Last time I did a little bit more work, also adding the number of cars sold and then just making everything a little bit prettier. One thing though, if you remember last time, the targets actually looked a bit different, and that's because last time we kind of used a top-down approach, just saying how much money do we want to make, instead of using more of a bottom-up approach of actually defining the targets, i.e. looking at the number of cars sold and then deriving the targets from there, which is what I did this time. So I added a little bit of work here on the average order value and then just use that, define targets for the number of cars sold and then derive the revenue from that. However, the problem that we arrived at last time by using Excel to load our targets into Power BI and then modeling it like this is that this is now based on years, so years of purchase. But if we actually now drill into our charts, we can see, and there's cross-filtering going on here, we shouldn't be worried about that, but you can see that the target is only associated with the first quarter here, and we can even drill deeper and we will see, yeah, it's not very dynamic. What we really want to see is kind of a breakdown of that yearly target into quarters, months and so forth to make it more dynamic and really be able to drill up and down and still always have the target present. So that's what we're going to do today. This is what we looked at last time. This is the sheet. So I just added the sales. This is already uploaded in Power BI now. However, how are we going to achieve the breakdown of our yearly targets? There's a couple of ways to do it. Like I said last time, I find the best way to do it is using SQL. And so today we are going to make more use of Y42 V3 and do it there. It's also possible in Power BI, but I find it's going to get a bit messy. So what we want to do now, we want to upload our target sheet in Y42 here and then do a little bit of modeling. So we're in the data catalog view and we want to add a new source. What you can see, this is only a small number of sources that they have already in V3. In V2 they have many more. However, we don't have Excel here. So we're just going to use Google Sheets and we are going to name it, but it's the showcase, I guess. And it's actually a Google Sheet. So let's do it like this. That makes most sense. And let's create our new source. Now we need to authorize it. And here we can already see that we need a spreadsheet link and then we can authenticate it. So of course we need to get our Excel file into a Google Sheet. So I already opened here my Google Drive, so I can just easily upload this here. So it's this file and I just upload it here. That's done. However, note this is still an Excel file. It's just uploaded into Google Drive, and since our source here is, or integration here is a Google Sheet, we still need to convert this, right? Otherwise it will fail, and it does fail. So maybe let's just open this in Google Sheets here, and then it's very easy to convert this file into a Google Sheet. However, note this is now still kind of what we had from the query in Excel. I talked about this before, but you can easily, and you have this here in the output, you actually have a way to easily make this dynamic. So let's say you actually want to use this template file in Google Sheets, you can do that, and you just have to make, instead of using the query from Excel, which obviously is not available in Google Sheets, at least not out of the box, you could build it, but you can very easily use a query like this to actually derive it. However, today we don't need to do it because we already have here kind of what we need, right? So let's just use that. And via file here, we can just save this as a Google Sheet. And here we go. Now it actually is a Google Sheet. And now we have the it wants the spreadsheet link here, so let's just give it that. And then let's authenticate our, I don't think we need that. Let's authenticate. So now we're just authorizing us with OAuth, which is blocks. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, here we go. Now I'm using my account. All right, here we go. Now it will take a minute to show us the schema, and here we'll already see if this worked or not. Okay, here we go. So it's running discovery, writing the schema. Okay, here we can see that we have everything we need. So let's just use this. Now we have to, by the way, we're here on main, which is actually not best practice. One of the very cool things about V3 is we have a native Git integration that works very well in my experience. So ideally we would actually create a new branch here, a development branch, and then work on that. However, since this is kind of my test environment, this is not actually anything that's in production, it's also fine to just go ahead and keep working on main, and this is just what I'm going to do here. But ideally, especially if you collaborate with many people or you have a production environment, then do create these development environments using Git, of course. So here we just have our targets integration and committed, and then we can build our first import here once this is compiled and pushed. Here we go. Now let's just trigger a full import. This can also take a little bit of time, but here, since it's very few rows, this should be quite quick. So we just trigger the full import, and then we can have a look at the data and can start modeling it. Okay, so here we go. So what I would note here, first of all, the format of the date. So this will be something we have to watch out for when doing our base transformations. And then also, again, realizing that we don't need all of the target types here, and we can just use the ones we actually need. All right, so we have our source. So we just continue now working on main, and now we want to build a model, which just a staging model. Okay, and we can now either work here and build our query here in the data catalog view, or we can also switch into the code editor, which is basically a Visual Studio Code environment, which generally works quite well. So let's just do it here. So, okay, what do we actually want to do now? We want to do a base transformation of our data that we just imported, and then we want to break down our yearly targets into daily targets, which then we can load into Power BI, and this then enables dynamic drilling by just summing our targets. So if you drill up, it will just sum, for example, all days in a month or all days in a quarter and so forth, and that will make it work. So we just start with a base transform CTE here. We don't want to select yet. So now we need to parse, because if you remember, we actually had a string column in this very specific format of our dates, and so we want to parse this into an actual date now. We are using BigQuery SQL here, so we can use this function parse date, and then you have these formatting strings, which here we want to have it in this format, and then the column name was month. And by the way, we should actually be able to Right. We can seamlessly switch back and forth here, which is pretty cool. What I want to achieve now actually is I want to be able to view this next to each other. I'm kind of still new to, here we go, that's pretty sweet. That's the Visual Studio Code for you. So we have our sources somewhere down here. And, wait. Here, that's the YAML file. But that's fine. You can just use the YAML file because it will show us the columns here, right? And we also have the types, etc. And that's all we need. So we had the month column, which is actually a year. And then we wanted the target type, right? This is something we want to filter by. And then we also want to have the actual target. And this is now, and here we have auto completion, which is very sweet. And it was this table, and then it was called export. So this is pretty sweet, working quite well. And actually we don't really need this anymore now. Wait, this is not what we want, of course. Showcase targets, we don't need all of them. All right, now we're back. Cool, so we have our base transform. However, remember we actually only want specific target types, and this was gross revenue and sales, right? We could even now just check if this is working, which it should. Okay, so we have transformed our date here and have a date column. We have two target types. Okay, so this is, okay, this is, I think, a small bug, so something to report because the filter is not really working, but everything seems fine, right? Just one thing, this is a string. This should not be a string, right? We only have numbers here, so we want to cast this. We actually have integers, right? So we want to. So this should now be fine. Okay, so not best practice to use the keywords here also for the year, but it's fine. And now what we want to do is we want to be able to break down the targets into days, right? So what we need is we need also the number of days in a given year. And so we can do this with just a prep CTE, and we select all the columns we had from before, but then we also want to now count the number of days in a year, which is not always the same, right? We have leap years, so it can be 365 or 366 days, and a pretty easy way to do it is just using built-in functions. So from BigQuery, so we have the year, we take the last day of the year column, and we, again, that's not best practice to use column names, to use identifiers as column names here, but or modifiers, but anyways, so it's not quite clear what we actually, what is what here, but this is the column, this is the modifier. And then we want the difference between, in days, between the first date, which was the 1st of January, and then the last date, and then we have to just +1 to make it work, and then we have days in a year. So now let's maybe, and this is quite interesting here, which works quite well. You have all these okay, so this we still need to do. We have all this error correction, which is pretty sweet. And now this is gone. Cool. We have prep here. Let's have another look at the data now. So we should have the years, the number of days in the year. So here 2016 would have been a leap year, and we have the integers here, so everything looks good. And now we just have to break down our yearly targets into actual days, right? So what are we going to do? And there is an interesting problem now arising. If you remember, the numbers, the targets for sales were actually very low, which creates a little bit of an issue. How are we going to handle this? However, we just start with the year. Well, actually we wanted to have dates now, so we need a date series, right? We do need a date series. And let's start with our date series. We need a little bit of a prep here. We need the first date in our data, and then we also need the last date, and then we just create a series of days between those dates. So we just have a little bit of a preparation here where we just select the minimum of our year as first date, and then we take the last day from our last year, but we take the last day in the year, and that would be our last date, right? So this is from our prep, and now we are prepared to actually create the dates here. And we take this from first our little prep, and then we do use the unnesting of a generated date array between our first date and our last date, and we take the interval of 1 day, and then we call it full date, and that's already it. So now we have created a date series. Again, it probably complains about trailing white space. Line too long, we're going to ignore this for now. And now we can just break our targets down using what we already have. So we take our targets from prep here, we take the dates. So we start here by using full date, and I'm calling it DS, right? So we take it from the date series and we call it DS, and then we left join our targets into here, and we do that on the prep year equals, and now we have to take the year, so we trunk our full date, DS full date, to year, right? So now we're just joining the target from a given year onto all of the days in our date series for that given year, and that's already it. And so we have the full date here, we want the target type, and now we're actually going to break on our target. So we can now have to think about, okay, like if we have 12, right? If we have 12 sales that we target per year, if we break this down by 365, it's going to be a very small number. And so we might compare to 150 grand or whatever, right? So we might want to think a little bit about how are we going to round these results, how are we going to actually display them. So probably fine to just round it for a couple of decimals, and if the target type is gross revenue here, then I would probably just do it like maybe 1 or 2 decimals. 1 decimal should be fine. So we have to take care, because we're doing a division, right? We have to take care to catch any division by null and not create errors. So if null, then we just default to 0. And now we are just going to divide the target by days in year, right? So we have joined all the days of a given year into the year, and now we're just dividing the target by days in a year. So we have just a linear straight line for every target, for every day in the year. We have the proportional target for that day, and we do want to still default this to 0. even though it's, if you think about it, it's actually not necessary, right? Because there will always be days in a year. So this is too much. Generally good practice, but we will not need this here. And then we just, let's do it one decimal, and then if the target type, actually we only have one other target type, right? So then we might just want to round this by, let's say here we take 4. And then this would be our target. Let's see if this works or if we have any kind of error in here. Okay, we do. Unexpected keyword. Okay, obviously else doesn't need it then. That's just for a case when structure, so let's try this again. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Now here you can see a very small number, but this should be fine. Okay, and now here you can see it's like for each target type we have, every day we have a target. So this is pretty much already what we want, and we can now just commit this, and then we should be able to now load this into Power BI, and then then we are basically ready to go. Here in V3 we could also now easily just create a scheduled build, so basically an orchestration for this model if we were going to change targets. For me, I think it generally makes sense because I take care of compiling the targets from my stakeholders. I will just run this manually. So of course I have lots of orchestrations running, but for targets I will actually just enter them into the sheet once I've compiled them, and then just let this model run, and then I'm good to go. So that's usually what I do. Now we have committed this now, so now we will need to build this, which I'm going to do now. Okay, here we go. Was a little whiz bug here. 9K rows running right now. Okay, so this looks good now, and we will now be able to just import this here in Power BI. So we can go to get data, more, and now we go to BigQuery. One thing, maybe we just have a look at this actually in BigQuery, because there is something important to note. So normally this is my data warehouse here in BigQuery. So normally you have the real name tables basically within this data warehouse, which is basically maintained, created by Y42, and then you have just the tables by name, which is very nice, of course, to connect this data warehouse to downstream applications like Power BI. However, due to a bug that's already reported in V3, right now I don't have that. So actually you have to look at this, which of course is not so handy for usage with downstream applications, but should still be fine. So we just have to find the right table. Okay, so this is finally it. So we can even quickly check this and just query this table, see if it is what we actually think it is, and this looks good, right? So now we just have to, for now, until this is fixed, we just have to note down the ID, at least the first couple of characters, and now we can go into Power BI. We just connect, which of course I already created a service account and I'm already connected, so now I can just go into here and just check the table. And so since I wrote this down, okay, it wants me to go into the, and again, so this is unfortunately empty, so I have to go into here, and now, okay, so this is the one. And this time we don't even have to really transform anything, we can just load it. We want to use import mode here, and now it's going to load for a minute. And then we just basically have to replace the previous table. So if you've seen the data model last time, it didn't change much. So we have our targets table here, but this will actually become this one now, right? So we can just delete this one. And here we might want to make slight changes. It broke my target metrics, which we will adjust. So we can just quickly rename this now into targets. And then what I find is good practice is to also rename the visible columns, which then just looks better when hovering over any value in a chart, and it'll make your stakeholders more happy, and also yourself if you look at any of your visualizations. So here we go. This is a decimal number, that's fine, right? We do want the revenue target to be a currency, but this is something we can do in a minute. Now we have to still connect this to our existing data model. So we are filtering targets by dim dates. This is exactly what we want. We're also filtering purchases by dim dates. So that means it will look nice in the visualization. And now we just have to go in and fix our metrics. And actually you can see it already did that, because the column names were the same. So this is not, these metrics are not, measures are not based on ID of anything, right? Not the ID of the table, not the ID of any column, but only on names. So now that we changed the names, they actually are automatically fixed, and here we can go in, it's already a currency. So now if you go back here, we can see now, okay, this is actually working, right? So if we go back in this view, this is exactly what we saw in the beginning. And maybe one thing we still want to do in the format tab, we can edit interactions, and let's not cross interact here. And now we can nicely drill down here, for example 2022, right? We now have the targets displayed for anything. What's interesting is that it's not an entirely straight line. Why is that? Of course, different number of days in a month, right? If we go to days now, it's just a straight line. And then here this is also the interesting part, right? Because here we had this issue, it's just 12 sales. The target here is like 9 sales in a year. So if you break this down on daily level, then the number becomes ridiculously small. So that is still the case, and it still then looks pretty weird if you look at this on like a daily level. But in a quarter, it's still reasonable, right? Target 2, and now you could allow more decimals here, and then it would probably look a bit different. But this is not something we're going to do now, right? It's just rounding this to 1, which we could change that, but that's details. Details matter, but we're not going to do that now. One thing I do want to mention is now it's dynamic. Our targets are dynamic based on date. However, if you generally build reports, right, you have a nice star schema, then there's many other dimensions that you will have, and you might have a report with lots of slicers, and there's lots of dimensions. And it's actually not so straightforward to make that work, because usually you don't have targets for every dimension, right? You have maybe revenue target by channel for marketing, or like spend by channel or something like that, and maybe only a couple of channels, not all channels. And you are actually segmenting by many more dimensions, and so this becomes a bit tricky and on how to best display this. But if it's rather simple, right, and it's just based on date, then now this would be set up pretty straightforward. And yeah, I hope this will help you. If you have any questions, just reach out to me, and see you next time.